The sound of the saw started before I even realized my morning had changed. I remember standing barefoot on the cold tile of my kitchen floor, holding a mug of coffee that suddenly felt heavier than it should have, when I heard it again outside, steady, mechanical, deliberate. I walked to the front door and opened it just enough for the early air to hit my face, and that's when I saw her. Deborah Whitmore, HOA president, standing at the edge of my property like she already owned it, pointing toward my privacy hedge as if it were nothing more than a line on a map she had the right to erase. 2 workers were following her instructions, trimming back years of carefully grown green barrier that separated my home from the street, from the world, from everything I didn't ask to deal with anymore after my divorce. I didn't say anything at first. I just watched the hedge fall away in small controlled sections, leaves scattering across the gravel like quiet evidence of a decision I was never included in. Deborah didn't even look at me when she spoke, just kept her eyes forward, voice calm, almost satisfied, telling the crew it was non-compliant with community visibility standards. That phrase stuck in my head more than anything else. Community visibility standards. Like my life needed to be on display for approval. I set the coffee down inside, walked back out, and that's when she finally acknowledged me, smiling like this was routine, like this was normal, like this was something I was supposed to accept without question. I asked her what authority she had to remove a living barrier from my property line, and she didn't raise her voice, didn't hesitate, just handed me a folded notice with my address printed at the top and said the HOA had already voted on aesthetic alignment improvements. That was the moment something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like a door locking somewhere I couldn't see. The hedge wasn't just plants to me. It was privacy. It was distance. It was the only thing that made my house feel like mine after everything else in my life had been signed away or divided or negotiated into something smaller. Deborah turned back toward her crew and told them to continue, and I remember the sound of the clippers restarting, sharp and repetitive, cutting through branches that had been there longer than she had been president of anything. I stood there long enough to feel the weight of every second, long enough to notice how comfortable she was in my space, how certain she was that I would just stand down. She didn't know I wasn't the kind of person who reacted quickly. She didn't know I studied patterns. She didn't know I noticed details other people ignored. And she definitely didn't know that what she was taking down that morning wasn't just a hedge. It was a line she should have never crossed. The rest of that morning did not slow down. If anything, it accelerated in a way that felt deliberate, like the neighborhood itself had decided to respond to what just happened in front of my house. I watched Deborah Whitmore walk back to her vehicle without a single glance over her shoulder, as if the hedge had never been mine in the first place. 10 minutes later, a second envelope appeared in my mailbox, already stamped and sealed, as though it had been waiting for the exact moment the last branch hit the ground. Inside was a formal notice referencing unapproved landscape density reduction, followed by a fine amount that felt excessive for something I was never asked about. I stood there reading it twice, not because I did not understand the words, but because I was trying to understand the timing. It was not random. It was coordinated. By noon, a white utility truck had parked across the street, and I noticed 2 neighbors watching from behind their curtains in a way that told me this was already becoming a story in the community. The hedge was gone, but what replaced it was something worse: attention. That afternoon, I received another notice requiring me to attend a mandatory HOA compliance meeting scheduled for the following evening, along with a request that I remove all exterior cameras facing the front of my property because they allegedly violated shared visual harmony guidelines. I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because of how far it had gone in such a short time. My cameras were pointed at my own driveway. By sunset, I noticed chalk markings along the edge of my yard where the hedge used to be, small survey points placed with quiet precision. No one knocked on my door to explain it. No one asked permission. It felt less like maintenance and more like measurement. The next day, Deborah appeared again, this time with printed diagrams showing what she called approved replacement landscaping options, all of which removed any meaningful barrier between my home and the street. She spoke about community aesthetics like it was law, not opinion, and every sentence carried the assumption that resistance was temporary. I told her I would review it, and she smiled like she already knew the outcome. That evening, I attended the HOA meeting, sitting in a folding chair at the back of a room filled with people who had already formed their conclusions. Deborah stood at the front like she belonged there more than anyone else, describing my property as visually inconsistent with neighborhood flow. I listened carefully, not interrupting, noticing how often she referenced rules that were never shown in writing, only described as understood standards. When she finished, several neighbors nodded without speaking, and I realized something important in that moment. Enforcement in this place did not require truth, only repetition. After the meeting, I walked home slowly, passing identical houses with identical trimmed lawns, thinking about how quickly a single line of plants had turned into a justification for everything that followed. When I reached my driveway, I noticed a small laminated tag tied to the fence post where the hedge used to be, labeled "Pending Compliance Review." That was when I started looking deeper into the property guidelines myself, not the summaries, not the interpretations, but the actual recorded ordinances referenced in the HOA documents. What I found did not immediately change anything, but it did something more important. It confirmed that there were limits, written in plain language, about environmental modifications and protected pollinator habitats that most homeowners never bothered to read. I closed the document and sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the evening air moving through an open space that used to be green, realizing that the absence of the hedge was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something I had not fully decided how to respond to yet. The following morning felt different, not because anything visible had changed, but because everything invisible had. The space where the hedge used to be now felt like an open invitation rather than a boundary, and I noticed things I had ignored before, like how sound traveled farther from the street and how often cars slowed down as they passed my house. By 8 a.m., another notice was already taped to my front door, this one more formal than the last, referencing failure to comply with mandated aesthetic restoration timelines, and increasing the fine schedule in daily increments. I read it twice before placing it on the kitchen counter, noticing how the language had shifted from suggestion to pressure. Later that day, I saw Deborah Whitmore again, standing across the street speaking with two other HOA board members, pointing toward my yard as if discussing a problem that needed correction rather than a person who lived there. I did not approach them. Instead, I went back inside and started reviewing every document I had previously downloaded from the county property portal, cross-referencing HOA guidelines with municipal environmental codes. The more I read, the more I noticed inconsistencies in how the HOA interpreted landscaping restrictions versus actual legal boundaries. That evening, I expanded my search beyond neighborhood rules and began focusing on agricultural and environmental statutes within my state, specifically anything related to pollination zones, native insect protection, and land use exemptions for ecological maintenance. It was not immediate, but after several hours of reading, I found it, a section of environmental code that clearly stated private landowners were permitted to maintain registered pollinator habitats, including managed bee colonies, provided they were documented and located within property boundaries that met minimum setback requirements. I paused for a moment when I read it, not because it was surprising, but because of what it implied. My property, with its large open yard and former garden area behind the house, met those requirements without modification. I made a copy of the regulation and placed it beside the HOA notices, comparing the two as if they belonged to different realities that were now colliding in the same space. The next day, the HOA sent a formal letter demanding the immediate removal of any remaining natural growth zones, arguing that unmanaged vegetation contributed to inconsistent neighborhood presentation. I noticed how carefully they avoided defining what natural growth actually meant, as if ambiguity itself was part of their authority. At the same time, I began receiving comments from neighbors in indirect ways, not confrontations, but small signals like longer pauses when I was outside, or conversations that stopped when I approached the sidewalk. Deborah seemed to be controlling not just enforcement, but perception. That afternoon, I drove to the County Agricultural Extension Office and requested information about certified pollinator programs. The staff member explained it in simple terms, stating that homeowners could register portions of their property for ecological support use, which would place legal protections on those zones and limit external interference. I asked what would happen if a local association attempted to regulate such an area, and she responded without hesitation that HOA authority did not override environmental designation once properly filed. I remember sitting in my car afterward, holding the printed forms, realizing that the situation had already shifted without any visible confrontation. That night, I reviewed my backyard again, not as a residential space, but as a potential designated habitat. The absence of the hedge no longer felt like loss. It felt like exposure, and exposure meant clarity. For the first time since Deborah Whitmore had ordered the removal, I was no longer reacting to what had already happened. I was beginning to understand what was legally possible moving forward, and more importantly, what they had overlooked while assuming I would simply replace what they had taken. By the time I finalized the paperwork from the Agricultural Extension Office, the rhythm of my days had changed in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who had not lived inside a system like this. Everything looked normal on the surface, but every interaction carried a second layer now, like there was always something happening underneath the words being said. Deborah Whitmore did not reach out directly after that. Instead, I received a new series of notices that felt less aggressive and more strategic, almost like the tone had shifted from pressure to observation. The HOA requested updated landscaping compliance photos, a revised front yard layout plan, and confirmation that no unauthorized ecological modifications were being prepared. I noticed the phrasing carefully, especially the word unauthorized, as if they were already anticipating something I had not yet done. That morning, I walked through my backyard again, this time measuring distances with a simple tape measure, confirming setbacks, marking boundaries in quiet preparation. The air felt different without the hedge. It was no longer enclosed. It was open, exposed, and legally visible in a way I had not fully appreciated before. Around midday, I made the decision to officially register my property as a pollinator support zone with the county program. The application process was straightforward, requiring property maps, photographic documentation, and confirmation that no hazardous conditions would be created for surrounding parcels. I submitted everything electronically and received an automated confirmation within minutes. There was no dramatic reaction, no immediate consequence, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had been recorded into the system. That same afternoon, I noticed Deborah driving slowly past my house again, her vehicle reducing speed just enough to observe without stopping. She did not wave, did not signal, just looked. I understood then that she was no longer acting on assumption alone. She was watching for verification. The next day, I received a formal HOA emergency review notice requesting an on-site inspection of my property within 48 hours due to environmental classification uncertainty. The language had become more careful, less emotional, more procedural. I attended the scheduled inspection at the agreed time, standing on my front walkway while two HOA representatives arrived alongside Deborah. They carried clipboards and printed guidelines, but no sense of urgency. It felt like a routine evaluation to them, not a confrontation. Deborah began by referencing the removal of the hedge, describing it as a necessary correction to restore visibility compliance. I listened without interrupting, watching how she avoided acknowledging anything beyond the aesthetic framework she preferred. When she finished, I handed over my county certification documents. The moment she saw the official seal, her expression did not change immediately, but the pace of her reading slowed. The inspectors reviewed the paperwork carefully, stepping a few feet into the backyard for measurement verification. I did not speak during this process. There was no need. The documentation was already doing the work. Deborah attempted to raise concerns about neighborhood uniformity, but one of the inspectors calmly explained that registered ecological zones were protected under state environmental regulation and could not be overridden by private association rules. The phrase, "cannot be overridden," lingered in the air longer than anything else said that day. The inspection concluded without incident, but the tone when they left was different. Less certainty, more recalibration. That evening, I noticed fewer cars passing slowly. Fewer glances. Fewer pauses. It was not resolution yet, but it was a shift. The space where the hedge once stood no longer felt like absence. It felt like designation. And in that designation, I realized something important had changed in how the system around me now had to respond. The days after the inspection did not bring closure, but they brought something closer to silence, the kind of silence that happens when a system is recalibrating rather than resolving. I noticed it first in the absence of new notices. For weeks, my mailbox had been a steady source of printed warnings, adjustments, and compliance demands, but now it sat untouched, as if whoever had been driving the pressure had paused to reconsider the direction of it. I did not assume it was over. I had learned enough by then to understand that pauses in enforcement are rarely peace. They are often reassessment. Around that same time, I began receiving brief automated messages from the county confirming that my pollinator designation status was active and recorded in the state environmental registry. Each message was simple, factual, and final in tone, stating that the classification carried statutory protection under agricultural and ecological preservation guidelines. I printed each confirmation and kept them in a folder beside the HOA correspondence, watching how two entirely different systems of authority now coexisted over the same piece of land. One was trying to maintain appearance. The other was enforcing law. Deborah Whitmore did not contact me directly during this period, but I became aware of her presence in more indirect ways. A neighbor mentioned a longer than usual HOA board meeting that had extended into the evening. Another noted that printed flyers had been distributed reminding residents of shared visual consistency expectations, although no specific properties were named. I recognized the pattern. When direct enforcement loses strength, messaging shifts toward community pressure. Still, nothing escalated in the way it had before. My backyard remained quiet, but it no longer felt like empty space. It felt designated, as if the absence of the hedge had been replaced with something legally defined that no longer depended on opinion. One morning, I received a formal request for a second review, this time from a regional HOA oversight committee rather than the local board. The document referenced conflicting land use interpretation between private association enforcement and state environmental designation, and requested clarification regarding my pollinator habitat registration. The tone was noticeably different from previous notices. It was procedural rather than accusatory, structured more like an inquiry than a demand. I agreed to the review and prepared the same documentation again, but expanded with additional photographs, timestamps, and certified copies of my registration. When the committee arrived, there were 3 individuals, none of whom carried the same confidence I had seen in earlier interactions. They walked the property slowly, measuring distances, confirming boundaries, and comparing physical space to recorded maps. Deborah was not initially present during the inspection, which changed the dynamic significantly. Without her presence, the tone remained neutral, almost academic. I stood at the edge of my driveway while they examined the rear yard, occasionally asking technical questions about habitat maintenance requirements and compliance thresholds. I answered only when necessary, letting the documentation speak where possible. After nearly an hour, one of the committee members confirmed that the property met all conditions required for protected classification and that no HOA directive could supersede state environmental designation without legal challenge at a higher jurisdiction. The statement was not dramatic. It was delivered in the same tone as all regulatory conclusions, but its effect was unmistakable. Later that afternoon, I noticed Deborah returning alone, parked at the curb without exiting her vehicle immediately. She stayed there longer than before, observing the house without the previous sense of authority she once carried. When she finally stepped out, she did not approach the property line. Instead, she remained on the sidewalk, holding a folder but not opening it. For the first time since this began, she was not directing anything. She was evaluating what remained within her control. I did not engage. I simply observed from my porch as the space between enforcement and limitation became visible in a way it had not been before. That evening, as the sun lowered across the open stretch of yard where the hedge once stood, I understood that the conflict was no longer about visibility or landscaping. It had shifted into something more structural, where one side operated on preference and the other on recorded authority. And in that structure, nothing needed to be forced anymore. It only needed to be recognized. The next shift did not come from Deborah Whitmore directly, but from the way the system around her began to respond. I noticed it first in a new document that appeared in my county portal, not as a warning, but as a formal clarification request regarding ecological designation boundaries and permissible land use intensity within residential overlays. It was subtle, almost administrative in tone, but the timing made its intention clear. Someone had escalated the review beyond the neighborhood level, and now every detail of my property classification was being examined under a wider lens. I printed the document and placed it beside everything else, not because I was confused, but because I wanted to see the shape of what was forming. That same morning, I received another HOA letter, this time carefully worded to avoid direct contradiction of state designation language. Instead, it requested voluntary modification of environmental features to maintain neighborhood aesthetic alignment while awaiting final regulatory interpretation. The phrase voluntary stood out more than anything else, because nothing about it felt voluntary. It felt like pressure translated into politeness. Later that day, I walked my property line again, measuring distances I had already measured twice before, confirming that nothing physical had changed, even though everything procedural had. The absence of the hedge had stopped being the center of conflict. Now the center was classification, and classification meant authority. Deborah Whitmore had begun operating differently. Instead of direct directives, she now communicated through layered channels, HOA notices referencing committee interpretations, neighbor newsletters emphasizing shared standards, and informal conversations that carried more implication than instruction. I observed how influence shifted when enforcement became uncertain. It no longer pushed. It suggested. And suggestion, when repeated enough, begins to feel like obligation to people who are not reading the underlying structure. By midweek, I received notice of a mediation session scheduled between myself, the HOA board, and a regional compliance advisor. The stated purpose was to resolve ongoing ambiguity regarding environmental integration within residential uniformity policy. I recognized the phrasing immediately. It was not a confrontation. It was a framing attempt. The session took place in a neutral community office, a small building with fluorescent lighting and rows of identical chairs. Deborah was already seated when I arrived, her demeanor more controlled than before, but less certain. There was no longer the same ease in how she occupied space. The regional advisor began by reviewing the county designation, stating clearly that my property had been officially classified under protected pollinator habitat status, and that any interference with that classification would require state-level review. The words were precise, deliberate, and non-negotiable. I watched Deborah listen without interruption, her hands resting on the table but not moving forward as they once had. When it was her turn to speak, she attempted to reintroduce aesthetic cohesion arguments, referencing community value and visual continuity, but each point was gently redirected back to regulatory framework. It was not a confrontation of emotion versus emotion. It was structure versus preference. And preference was losing ground. After the session ended, I stepped outside into the late afternoon air and noticed something I had not expected. The neighborhood felt quieter, not in sound, but in intent. The usual sense of observation from surrounding homes had diminished. It was as if attention itself had shifted elsewhere. That evening, I received confirmation from the county that my habitat registration had been expanded to include additional acreage within setback allowance, effectively increasing the protected zone around my property boundaries. I read the update twice, understanding its significance more clearly than anything that had happened before. It was not an escalation in conflict. It was an expansion of definition. The following morning, I saw survey markers being removed near the edge of my yard, not by me, but by a contractor hired to ensure compliance alignment with updated jurisdictional mapping. Deborah did not appear that day. Instead, I saw a notice posted at the HOA office referencing revised enforcement guidelines, stating that all future landscaping disputes involving designated ecological zones would be deferred to state environmental authority. There was no mention of my name, but there was no need. The structure had already made its decision. And for the first time since the hedge had been cut down, I realized the situation was no longer moving through resistance. It was moving through recognition. The change did not arrive with noise or confrontation, it arrived with paperwork, the kind that quietly replaces uncertainty with finality. I remember the morning it happened clearly because nothing about it felt dramatic at first. I checked my county portal as I had been doing out of habit, and there it was, an updated environmental designation confirmation, stamped and finalized, extending the protected pollinator classification across the full usable depth of my backyard with clearly defined jurisdictional boundaries. There was no ambiguity in the language anymore. It was not a proposal, not a review, not an interpretation. It was recorded status. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after reading it, not because I was surprised, but because I understood what it meant in a way I had not fully allowed myself to earlier. This was no longer about disagreement between me and the homeowners association. It was about hierarchy of authority, and that hierarchy had already been decided somewhere above the level where Deborah Whitmore operated. By late morning, another notice arrived from the homeowners association, but the tone had changed completely from earlier weeks. There was no longer language about compliance pressure or aesthetic enforcement. Instead, it referenced updated procedural alignment with state environmental rulings and stated that all prior landscaping disputes related to my property were now considered outside the association enforcement scope. I read that sentence twice, slowly, because it carried more weight than anything else I had received. It meant the system that had been pressing against me was no longer recognized as valid. In that specific context. Later that day, I saw Deborah Whitmore for the first time in nearly a week. She was standing near the community bulletin board outside the clubhouse, not speaking, just reading. She did not have the same posture she used to carry when she moved through the neighborhood. There was no direction in her stance, no assumption of control. When she noticed me, she did not approach. She simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement that felt more like recognition than authority. I did not stop. I continued walking, because there was nothing left to negotiate at that level anymore. The following evening, I was officially requested to attend what was described as a final administrative clarification meeting. The location was the same community office, but the tone of the invitation itself made clear that this was not a dispute resolution session. It was a procedural closure. When I arrived, the seating arrangement had changed. The regional compliance representative was present again, along with a legal advisor affiliated with state environmental oversight. Deborah was there as well, but she was not positioned at the center. She sat slightly to the side, hands folded, listening more than speaking. The meeting began with a summary of the environmental designation, followed by confirmation that all prior homeowners association enforcement actions regarding my property were to be formally discontinued in accordance with state authority precedents. There was no argument presented against it. Not because there was agreement, but because there was no jurisdictional path left to challenge it at that level. Deborah spoke only once during the session. She asked a procedural question about how future neighborhood planning would account for properties with ecological classification. The answer she received was measured and direct, explaining that such properties would be excluded from aesthetic enforcement parameters and managed solely under state environmental guidelines. There was no emotional reaction in the room, only acknowledgement of administrative boundaries being redrawn. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside and stood for a moment in the parking lot. The air felt the same, the neighborhood looked the same, but the structure behind it no longer operated in the same way. I noticed how quiet everything had become, not because anything was missing, but because there was nothing left competing for control over that specific piece of ground. A few days later, I received the final notice from the Homeowners Association, confirming closure of all active enforcement files related to my property. There was no warning, no implication of future review, only confirmation of administrative termination. I placed the document in the same folder as everything that came before it, not as a trophy, but as a record of sequence. That evening, I stood in my backyard where the hedge used to be, looking across the open space that had started everything. The structure that once tried to define that space had been replaced by something else entirely, not conflict, not resistance, but recognition. And in that recognition, there was nothing dramatic left to prove, only the quiet understanding that when authority is written in different layers, it is not force that decides the outcome, but which layer remains valid when everything else stops speaking. The morning after everything officially closed did not feel like victory in the way people usually imagine it. There were no celebrations, no announcements, no visible change in the neighborhood itself, just a quiet shift in how everything functioned around me, as if a system that had been running in the background for months had finally stopped querying my property as a problem to be solved. I woke up early out of habit, and stepped outside with a cup of coffee, expecting to see the same invisible tension that had defined every morning since the hedge was cut down, but instead there was only stillness, not empty stillness, but resolved stillness, the kind that follows when a decision has already been made at a level higher than daily conversation. Later that morning I checked my mailbox and found nothing new, no notices, no revisions, no compliance reminders. Only the final confirmation documents I had already seen, now duplicated in physical form as if the system itself wanted to ensure there was no misunderstanding left. I placed them back inside without rereading them, not because they no longer mattered, but because they had already done their job. By midday I noticed something subtle across the street. Deborah Whitmore's vehicle was not parked in its usual position near the curb where she often observed the neighborhood, instead it was gone entirely. And the absence of it carried more meaning than its presence ever did. I walked slowly along my driveway and realized that I was no longer watching for enforcement behavior, no longer anticipating correction or review. The environment had stopped responding to me as an exception and started treating my property as a defined constant within its structure. That was the moment I understood how complete the shift really was. Later that afternoon I saw a small gathering at the community clubhouse, nothing formal. Just residents talking in low voices near the entrance, and I noticed a different tone in their conversations, not hostility, not support, but uncertainty, the kind that appears when rules that once felt absolute are suddenly revealed to have boundaries they never fully understood. I did not join the conversation, I simply observed for a moment before continuing on my way, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove, and nothing left to correct. When I returned home I stood again in the backyard where the hedge used to define the edge between my space and everything beyond it, and I noticed how the absence no longer felt like exposure, it felt like definition. The land was no longer being interpreted through someone else's aesthetic framework, it was now recorded under an entirely different classification that did not require approval from the voices that once controlled it. That evening I received one final letter, not from the Homeowners Association directly, but forwarded through administrative channels confirming that all prior enforcement references associated with my property had been formally archived and would no longer be eligible for review under standard association procedures. There was no emotion in the language, no emphasis, only closure. I remember setting that letter down on the table and realizing that I did not feel the need to respond to anything anymore, not because I had won something in a dramatic sense, but because the structure that once required my reaction no longer existed in the same way. Over the next few days life slowly returned to normal patterns, neighbors resumed their routines, cars passed without slowing, and the neighborhood returned to its familiar rhythm. But something fundamental had changed underneath all of it. I could see it in the way people no longer reference rules indirectly when they spoke. I could feel it in the absence of procedural tension whenever I stepped outside, and I could understand it in the simplest way possible. Nothing about my property needed to be defended anymore because it was no longer being questioned at the level where it mattered, and in that realization there was no final confrontation waiting. No dramatic resolution left to arrive, only the quiet certainty that when Authority is properly defined, it does not need to be enforced repeatedly, it simply becomes the baseline reality everyone else adjusts to, and for the first time since the hedge had been cut, I stood in complete stillness, not as a target, not as a case, but as a fixed point within a system that had finally finished recalculating around me. The final days did not announce themselves with any sense of completion. They simply unfolded like a system settling into a steady state after months of instability, and I found myself noticing the absence of pressure more than the presence of anything new. I would step outside each morning and expect some form of correction or follow-up, some reminder that the situation was still being monitored, but there was nothing, not even the subtle signs I had learned to read before. No slow passing vehicles, no lingering looks from neighbors, no informal conversations that carried hidden references to my property. It was as if the neighborhood had collectively agreed to stop treating my house as a variable in its equation, and that realization carried a strange kind of weight, not emotional, but structural, like standing inside a building after the scaffolding has been removed and discovering the walls were always meant to stand on their own. A week passed like this, then another, and during that time I stopped checking documents with urgency. I still reviewed them occasionally, but now it was out of routine rather than necessity. The county designation remained active, unchanged, and the homeowners association records showed no new entries related to my address. Even the language in their general communications shifted away from anything resembling enforcement and toward general reminders about shared community standards without specific reference points. Deborah Whitmore was no longer visible in the neighborhood the way she had been before. Her presence, once defined by observation and positioning, now reduced to absence without explanation, and strangely that absence felt more final than any confrontation could have been. One afternoon I walked the full perimeter of my property slowly, not measuring or verifying anything, just observing. And I noticed how the space where the hedge once stood had become part of a larger continuity rather than a gap. The yard no longer felt divided between exposed and protected, it simply felt complete within its new classification. I remember stopping at the back edge of the property and looking out across the open line of sight toward the street, expecting to feel something like vulnerability or unfinished business. But there was nothing unresolved there anymore, only clarity. Later that day I received one last piece of correspondence, not a notice, not a request, but a formal closing acknowledgement confirming that all prior disputes, filings, and internal reviews associated with my property had been archived under final resolution status. The wording was procedural, almost indifferent, but its meaning was absolute. There would be no further review, no continuation, no reclassification under HOA authority. I placed that document in the same folder as everything else and closed it. Without rereading, and for the first time since the initial morning when the hedge was cut, I did not feel like I was responding to anything at all. The system that had once defined my interaction with the neighborhood had completed its adjustment and moved on, and what remained was simply my property existing without interpretation, without challenge, and without the need for correction. I stood outside that evening as the light faded across the open yard, listening to the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood returning to ordinary life, and I understood then that nothing about this ending was dramatic or loud. It was the opposite. It was the absence of further friction, the absence of repeated questioning, the absence of imposed meaning, and in that absence there was something more permanent than any victory could have been. There was stability, and for the first time I was not part of a conflict still being decided. I was simply someone standing on ground that no longer required permission to exist.